So yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone. This is the Wildlife Damage Management Working Group's first webinar, so we're excited that TWS is letting us host it. Today's webinar is going to explain the basics of wildlife damage management and why it's important to the wildlife profession. As we all know, humans continue to alter habitats, sometimes in dramatic ways, and these altered environments can easily have negative impacts on wildlife by removing important ecosystems, introducing toxins, diseases, and invasive species. However, those same altered habitats can also provide positive impacts for some other species, tend to be generalist species, and that can result in increased human-wildlife interactions. So during today's webinar, we will introduce the field of wildlife damage management and explain its relevance through several examples of research and management projects. But to give you an idea, oh, my clicker's not working. Okay, hold on. Right from the start, we might be having new screen difficulties. There we go, okay. So yeah, this is what to anticipate. First, since it is the working group's first webinar, I wanted to give an introduction to the working group. That'll be followed by an introduction to principles and role of wildlife damage management by John Cepek, and then followed by a presentation by Travis DeVault, and then our Q&A. If you do have questions, we are going to hold them until the end, and I believe there should be a Q&A box that you can enter your question. So yeah, if you have a question during any of those talks, please put it in the Q&A. I see that someone's raised their hand. Andy Kellner, did you have a question? I maybe put it in the chat. I'm not sure. Oh, let's see. Okay, okay, got it, Andy. All right. Well, and before I talk about the working group, just a little introduction about myself. I am the chair of the Wildlife Damage Management Working Group, and I'm an organizer of the TWS Out in the Field initiative as well. I'm also the black bear and fur bear biologist for the state of North Carolina. And so a little bit about our working group. Boy, it's taken a while for the slides to change. I'm not sure why. There we go. So yeah, our working group's been around a while, almost 30 years. So next year will be our 30th anniversary. We were created back in 1994 when our working group's charter was approved by TWS Council at the annual TWS conference that was taking place that year in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And our working group has several goals, and related to those goals, we have several objectives. Now, I'm not gonna read through all these goals, just for the sake of time and also not to bore you. But in a nutshell, our working group's goal is to enhance and promote communications, knowledge, techniques, research, and innovations regarding wildlife damage management, as well as provide wildlife damage management subject matter expertise for policies and decision making. If you want to read more about our goals and our objectives, please go to our website, which is wildlife.org/WDMWG. Also wanted to take this opportunity to recognize our current executive board, who put a lot of work into making sure that we are meeting the expectations of our membership of the working group. And so I want to introduce Mark Smith as our past chair. Obviously, I'm chair. Dana Morin is chair-elect, and Shiloh Johnson is our secretary-treasurer. And then we have 6 board members, one of which, Justine Smith, is our student rep. We have a dedicated at-large board member that represents students. So if you're a student on this webinar and you're a member of the working group, there is a place for you on the board so you can hone in on your leadership skills. As you can see, one of our speakers, John Cepek, is also a board member. Just wanted to briefly go over some of the activities the working group conducts. Probably our most visible and substantial activity is our biennial Wildlife Damage Management Conference. The very first Wildlife Damage Management Conference took place in 1984. And then we had our most recent one in April of this year in Logan, Utah at Utah State University. Our next conference is planned for spring of 2025, and at this point, we anticipate it's going to be somewhere in the Northeast region. We do produce proceedings from those conferences, and so if you're interested in looking at the proceedings, we haven't posted the proceedings from this year's conference yet, but past proceedings are posted on the Digital Commons section of the Utah State University website, and there's the web address. We've been producing a quarterly newsletter since 2006, and I'm pretty excited. Our next newsletter is coming out in early July, and it'll be the first newsletter by our new newsletter team that's comprised of 3 working group members. And our newsletter is our primary way to communicate with our membership. In the newsletter, we provide wildlife damage management updates, not only working group updates, but updates on research or events of interest to our membership. We're pretty proud of this activity, and that is our travel grants program. For many, many years, thanks to some of the proceedings from our biennial conference, we're able to support travel grants. And currently we offer 4 grants a year, each for $500. Those grants are for all members of the Wildlife Damage Management Working Group, students and professionals. And those grants typically go to helping to assist with going to the TWS annual conference, going to our biennial wildlife damage management conference, as well as the vertebrate pest conference. And more information on that is on our website. One new thing we started last year is we now provide a Distinguished Service Award. This Distinguished Service Award was given to Scott Hingstrom. He was the first recipient. We presented it to him at November of 2022. And pretty much the Distinguished Service Award is an award given to working group members that we want to recognize because they've made a significant and sustained contribution, not only to our working group, but to the wildlife damage management profession. Like other working groups, we will review position statements when we're asked to. We can provide, again, that subject matter expertise to inform TWS council and staff on position statements. Our most recent position statement that we reviewed was the one some of you probably heard about, and that is the, make sure I get the title right, Role of Firearms in Wildlife Conservation and Management in North America. We really feel that our input really was helpful and beneficial in the final version of that position statement. And then lastly, we do hold an annual business meeting that runs concurrent with the TWS conference. It's our way for updating our members on what we've been doing, what we plan to do, and to get feedback from members on their thoughts on activities of the working group. Tentatively, our next business meeting will be held in Louisville, Kentucky, again during the annual conference, November 7th, which is a Tuesday from 7 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. And just so you know, yes, it's an early start, and so we make sure we have coffee and treats so that you've got sugar, you've got caffeine for that early morning start. All right, so that's enough about the working group. What you're really here for is to hear from John and Travis. So with that, I do want to introduce John. He is a wildlife ecologist for Cleveland Metro Parks. He's going to give a little bit more of his background in wildlife damage management, but currently under Cleveland Metro Parks, he sees a long-term urban ecology project using 200 wildlife cameras paired with vegetation monitoring sites within the Cleveland Metro Parks to better understand the influence humans have on wildlife. And with that, John, take it away.
Thank you. Bear with me as I transition my screen here. Okay, I think I'm going to turn my video off. Well, we'll go ahead. We'll see how it is with bandwidth. All right, well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the role and relevance of wildlife damage management. So I'm going to give the first half of the presentation, as Colleen mentioned, and then Travis will wrap it up. So early in my career, I spent 4 years with the National Wildlife Research Center, which is the federal institution devoted to resolving problems caused by the interaction of wild animals and society. The center applies scientific expertise to the development of practical methods to resolve these problems and to maintain the quality of environments shared with wildlife. I spent 11 years of my career with USDA Wildlife Services, and if you look at their website, it states that the mission of Wildlife Services is to provide federal leadership and expertise to resolve wildlife conflicts to allow people and wildlife to coexist. The latter part of my federal time was as the district supervisor of the area in red. In 2014, I took the newly established wildlife ecologist position in Cleveland Metro Parks. So here's my brief Cleveland Metro Parks infomercial, but it's to provide some perspective of my job. Cleveland Metro Parks was established in 1917 as a separate political subdivision of the state of Ohio. There are 18 reservations across 6 counties, over 24,500 acres within 48 diverse human communities, 100 miles of paved road, over 300 miles of trail. And for some scope, we had almost 20 million visitors in 2020. So as a wildlife ecologist, I'm the manager of wildlife in Cleveland Metro Parks, and I provide professional expertise for the conservation and management of wildlife and wildlife habitat within the framework of an urban park district, including the management of human-wildlife conflict. So my intent is not to share my CV. My intent is to talk about how this is related to the relevance of wildlife damage management in the wildlife profession. So I was hired as the Cleveland Metro Parks wildlife ecologist, but it really was my experience in wildlife damage management and dealing with human-wildlife conflict from my other jobs I felt important to mention that got me this job. So first and foremost, any experience you can gain in wildlife damage management, in my opinion, is extremely valuable to your career, future jobs, and being successful really in any wildlife professional position. So let's establish what we're talking about. What is wildlife damage management? Wildlife Services defines it as the alleviation of damage or other problems caused by or related to the presence of wildlife. Dr. Michael Conover's book, Resolving Human-Wildlife Conflicts, is a great reference, and he adds these points. Wildlife damage management is built upon the fundamental knowledge gained in the fields of ecology, behavior, population dynamics, and wildlife management. The same principles apply whether we're trying to increase or decrease a population, regardless of our motives. And the Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management says that wildlife damage management, which I will refer to as WDM often in this presentation, is the process of dealing with vertebrate species that cause damage to food, fiber, personal property, natural resources, threaten human health and safety through disease, collision, attacks, or cause a nuisance. And lists these goals: reduce damage to a tolerable level, use methods that are cost-effective, use methods that are safe for people and the environment. So some examples relative from my career. An example of damage management related to human health and safety, my first technician job was with the rabies management program, and then later I supervised the program in Northern Ohio. So the goal of this program is to prevent the further spread of wildlife rabies and eventually eliminate terrestrial rabies in the US through an integrated program that involves the use of oral rabies vaccination targeting wild animals. In Ohio, ORV targets raccoon strain rabies. Additionally, I want to mention that this goes beyond health and human safety when we consider potential impacts of this fatal disease on declining populations of native wildlife like gray fox in Ohio or in other species like spotted skunks. An example of wildlife damage to natural resources: federal and state agencies manage double-crested cormorants in Ohio. I was involved in this project. Banning of the DDT, bird protection laws, and the expansion of the catfish farming industry on wintering grounds were variables that contributed to significant increases in cormorant populations. So these growing populations were having a negative impact on the important natural areas in Ohio and other areas, and in the western basin of Lake Erie, affecting state-threatened black-crowned night herons and other colonial waterbird colonies through habitat degradation and nest site competition. An example of wildlife damage related to invasive species: feral swine are a considerable concern nationally in Ohio. They decimate habitat, they damage crops, and are vectors of many diseases, which is a risk to Ohio's pork industry. Another example of wildlife damage from an invasive species: in 2012, while I was with Wildlife Services, I was directed to manage invasive mute swans in Ohio. In the Great Lakes region, introduced mute swan numbers have been growing rapidly and impacting native wildlife and habitat. In Ohio, our first survey showed an incredible increase in mute swan numbers. Native trumpeter swans were reintroduced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Ohio Division of Wildlife, with the help actually from Cleveland Metro Park Zoo in the 90s. State surveys showed a major decline in nesting success of Ohio trumpeter swans related to competition from increasing mute swans. I will talk more about the success of this program later. So the projects I mentioned are large-scale population level management that I worked on. However, in the wildlife profession, there are obviously local situations in wildlife damage management where we are dealing with situations with select individual animals, such as a sick coyote that is acting aggressively. So after giving examples of population management on regional issues, let's talk about this as a wildlife professional evaluating damage at a local level. One reference I have found helpful in my career is this from Wildlife Services. So Wildlife Services is tasked by federal government to assess situations and assist in resolving human-wildlife conflicts when they arise. And they do this with this decision-making model. This step-by-step approach helps address requests for assistance with wildlife damage. And the steps are to receive a request for assistance, assess the problem, evaluate wildlife damage control methods, formulate wildlife damage control strategy, provide assistance, monitor and evaluate results of the management actions. So when direct management is provided, it's necessary to monitor the results. Monitoring is important for determining whether further assistance is required and you cycle back through the steps, or whether the problem has been resolved and the project ends. So evaluation is obviously used to determine whether additional techniques are necessary. So in my opinion, this second step is the most important to assess the problem. This is an important thing because often it is not a problem, but rather someone who may not understand or are scared of wildlife, especially in urban areas, and I'm going to talk about this, or misidentification of species. So let me talk a little bit more about this as well. Species identification is an incredibly important step in wildlife damage management. Often we don't see the animal, or the public doesn't see the animal, but there are assumptions or outright guesses on what could cause damage, or there's just concern or fear about what could be out there and potentially cause damage or risk to people, pets, or property. So I can't stress enough the importance of species ID and problem assessment. So we know as wildlife professionals, we may not see the species, but we identify sign and what they're left behind. But most importantly, it's critical to specifically look at damage and properly ID what is causing the damage, not necessarily what is just there. Also, sometimes the animals that are seen may not be the ones causing the damage. So in ag presentations in my career, I reference Travis's Indiana study as an example of how a species can be blamed for damage, and then time and effort is invested on managing that species when it's actually not the one causing the damage. So wasted time and effort, not good, but most importantly, damage and financial loss continues. Very frustrating. And if you're involved, you're certainly not gaining any trust with a landowner. In this study from Travis DeVault's time at Purdue, corn producers reported deer damage twice as high as raccoon damage. The study actually found that raccoons were only about 10%, or I'm sorry, deer were only about 10% of the issue, and raccoons were ultimately 87% of what was causing the damage. I dealt with this a lot with Ohio's sweet corn industry in Northwest Ohio. So along the lines of problem assessment and species ID, let me shift gears a bit and transition to urban systems. Dating myself, my grad work was on coyotes in the 90s when they were relatively new to Northern Ohio. Since then, I spent a great deal of time on coyotes, not necessarily because they're actually causing damage, but because the public often perceives them as a problem and a damaging species without ever assessing the situation or truly understanding what's going on. So therefore, I give this presentation, this is the title slide, at least twice a year for communities and groups in Ohio. And the reason is to explain fact and fiction about coyote behavior and normal versus abnormal behavior, but most importantly, what causes it. So another point about why I give this presentation, in all of my wildlife jobs, most of us, time is often spent filtering information to assess if there really is a problem. Is there really damage or a threat or a risk to the public, pets, or other species? So we have a coyote reporting and monitoring system in Cleveland Metro Parks to help filter perception and identify what's really going on. It typically identifies normal or explainable behaviors, such as a coyote defending a den or pups when someone gets too close. However, there are rare situations where problem assessment identifies we have to get involved. So unlike population management, this may be selective removal. And in this case, this was selective removal of a coyote because it bit someone. Just as a note, this was the first of only 2 verified bites on a human in Ohio's history. We've been fortunate. The animal tested was positive for rabies. So thankfully it has been the only positive rabies positive coyote in Ohio. But if the animal had not been selectively removed and tested, we would have never known it was rabid and likely would have continued to bite other people and animals. So professionally filtering information and assessing the problem to identify if we need to get involved is a very important aspect of our work. And this may result in selective removal of individuals to resolve wildlife damage. So that is an example of what I call hands-on management. Overall in our profession, it is very important to know how to trap and handle wildlife for research or monitoring, incredibly important for our general wildlife profession. But there are also situations where when wildlife damage management take place, that can't be mitigated and direct management is necessary. So a landowner has done their best and damage persists. An animal is sick and a risk to the public, as I just mentioned. The situations Travis is going to talk about. I encourage all wildlife professionals to familiarize themselves with hunting and trapping references, best management practices, AVMA guidelines, etc. Everything that's out there, even if you don't think you need to use it, and to gain as much experience as you can with hands-on management so that you professionally do what is necessary to resolve wildlife damage and positively influence human-wildlife coexistence. If someone can or won't conduct selective wildlife removal when it is necessary, it forces the public to use non-sanctioned methods that are often inhumane to protect themselves and their property. And it's often done illegally, and often it doesn't even solve the problem. So if action should be taken, it should be done responsibly, following all guidelines by a wildlife professional. We are those wildlife professionals, and the Wildlife Society's Wildlife Damage Management Working Group is a great resource for information and training necessary to do our jobs to support human-wildlife coexistence. So I provided some examples of regional and population level management, and then I brought this through problem assessment and species ID. So now I'm a wildlife ecologist working in an urban system. So at the species level, here are some examples of common species most of us typically deal with in some sort of wildlife damage situation. Raccoons in homes and garbage, squirrel damage to sugar maples, deer damage, even more recently increasing urban turkey population, stopping traffic and damaging vehicles. So during presentations locally, I often ask, what do you think the most influential species is within Cleveland Metro Parks? So today for this audience, we can say, what is the most influential or damaging or challenging species we deal with? So often the answer that I get from the public is beaver. And when we think about species influence, an example certainly is the beaver because of how much they can change the land. However, we look at this picture of Seoul, South Korea in 1900 and compare it to what it looks like today with almost 10 million people. I'm going to put money on the human species over beaver for greatest change to systems. And let's talk about this. Let's discuss the changes made by our species to natural areas as they are developed into urban areas like the Cleveland metropolitan area on the right, where my responsibilities lie, and how much this can influence wildlife damage. Using Ohio as an example, let's consider the changes that have occurred since it first became a state in 1803, when it was 85% forested. European settlers add to Ohio's indigenous population, and the human population grows to 11.5 million people by 2010, according to the census data. So this is an incredible amount of our species in modern Ohio, in most modern states, right? But the interesting thing is, of those 11.5 million people, almost 80% of the population, 8.8 million people, live on less than 10% of Ohio's land. So the result is this concentration in modern Ohio of our species in developed or urban areas, and this continues to grow. And humans influence wildlife, especially in these urban areas. Interesting stuff happens when wildlife comes into contact with people and their lifestyles. I have stories about all of these pictures. Humans directly influence wildlife. They influence wildlife populations, and this can change wildlife behavior and significantly contribute to wildlife damage management. So let's use white-tailed deer as an example of how much people can influence a species. So specifically in Ohio, deer declined over time and became so rare that this picture shows that they were a major exhibit at the Cleveland Zoo in the late 1800s. White-tailed deer, major exhibit at the zoo. Along with 14 other species of mammals native to Ohio, they are extirpated. In 1909, deer were extirpated according to the Ohio Division of Wildlife. So when white-tailed deer return in the 30s, they return to a completely different environment changed by humans. And the results are we go from 0 deer to above 700,000 by 2010. And let's review briefly some information that contribute to this. One reason is because humans remove natural competition for resources from natural large herbivores like wood bison and elk. Humans also removed historic native predators in Ohio and many areas. And historically, humans have played a role as a predator. We may no longer subsistence hunt, and historically, we didn't hunt in urban areas. And humans intentionally, directly provide resources, and this also changes wildlife behavior. Humans also unintentionally provide significant resources to deer and many generalist species in urban areas. Some scope to anthropogenic resources. A Cleveland Metro Park study found that about 46% of park users said they fed wildlife at home. It's estimated that over 47 million people spent approximately $5 billion on birdseed and food for other wildlife in the US in 2016. 35% of all households in the US spent almost $4 billion on vegetable gardening in 2013, with the number increasing. So thinking about this and then thinking about natural ecological cycles, we know that winter is a time of natural stress to all wildlife, and in a natural system, survival and reproduction are linked to the amount of resources on the landscape. So contrary to what the public may think, deer have survived for millennia without humans feeding them. We know that winter, drought, times of low resources are natural stress cycles in any natural system. However, when people provide artificial resources during times of natural stress, it can disrupt the ecological balance of a system and influence fitness and reproduction. As an example of this, we worked with Dr. Stan Garrett in Ohio State University on a fawn survival study and found that 75% of fawns survived. And human resources also change predator-prey relationships. Coyotes opportunistically only took 5% of fawns. In other areas of the country, predation rates are much higher, and coyotes may rely on deer. In our area, that is not the case. Why? While coyotes may not have to rely on deer as a prey if we consider densities of many prey species coyotes find in urban areas compared to natural areas, and that humans regularly provide other easy food resources, and that records show over 20,000 deer are killed annually by vehicles in Ohio, and estimates from insurance companies are up to 68,000 deer that are available, easy prey, easy food, laying on the side of the road. The result is that this is a normal picture in developed areas when we talk about deer. And if we compare estimates of historic deer densities of 4 deer per square kilometer to surveys in the Cleveland Metro Parks and the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, a neighboring property, prior to deer management, that recorded an average of 46 deer per square kilometer. So this is 10 times as many deer on average. The results of this are illustrated with deer vehicle collisions. As I mentioned, in Ohio, 7 deaths and 844 human injuries were caused by deer vehicle collisions in 2013. So if your professional responsibilities lie with protecting health and human safety, you may have obligations for this damage management. However, my responsibilities currently lie in protecting natural resources. In 1998, this is what our forests typically looked like: healthy with an understory, intact native plant population, natural regeneration. However, in some reservations where high deer densities started to be documented, we recorded impact on the forest core, edge along parkways and bridle trails from overbrowsing of undergrowth and native plants by deer. So we began to consider managing a species that was removing a component of the ecosystem and stopping forest regeneration. And many studies over the years have explained how high densities of deer have an enormous ecological impact on other species. So all of these effects are what drive deer population management within Cleveland Metro Parks. And raccoons are another quick example. Prairie et al. Documented an average of 9 raccoons per square kilometer in rural areas and 67 per square kilometer in suburban areas. But the results of high densities of mesopredators like raccoons are wildlife damage through increased predation on listed species like Ohio's threatened Blanding's turtle. So we continue to work with wildlife services to reduce raccoon numbers to protect state listed threatened Blandings and spotted turtles in our Great Lakes Restoration Initiative project. So a large part of most wildlife professionals' job, I think, is figuring out human wildlife interactions and what is really going on, like this fantastic picture. And in my career, there have certainly been some very interesting situations between people and wildlife in urban systems. Sometimes that simply involves a more natural situation with wildlife behavior, natural wildlife behavior that requires wildlife management efforts to protect other species, resources, and ecosystem function. But much of our time can be spent dealing with human behavior. which you may not consider when you're a wildlife student. I didn't, but in the modern world where humans have changed everything, in wildlife damage management, we need to consider the effects of people on wildlife behavior and on wildlife populations. So it's very important to conduct wildlife monitoring and research, especially in a complex urban system. In Cleveland Metro Parks, we conduct wildlife surveys and monitoring on our properties. We monitor activity and conduct research to better understand relationships between animal species. But it is incredibly important to understand relationships, in our case, with park users and pets, as we try and balance conservation and recreation and mitigate wildlife conflict. So I encourage everyone to consider relationships between people, wildlife, and pets in wildlife damage management. We use the data we collect in our studies to understand what is going on with people and wildlife in urban areas. As humans, we all have opinions, we all have emotions, but the data is what we need to make science-based decisions. So we can all be emotional wildlife, we're humans in some ways about wildlife. However, considering professional responsibilities, and in my case, protecting natural resources in a beloved gold medal award-winning park system, I was mentioned that taxpayers don't want me to make decisions about public resources and wildlife based on whether I'm mad at it or scared of it. They want me to base natural resource decisions on science and facts. Science, not emotion-based decision-making, is where our professional responsibilities lie. Understanding human-wildlife relationships is also very important when we consider short-term solutions or reactive wildlife damage management, which we have to do sometimes, versus long-term proactive wildlife damage management. So what do I mean by this? For long-term solutions, it's unrealistic to think we can turn back the clock and go back to an Ohio that is once again 85% native forest and a balanced, naturally functioning system. For that, we would have to reintroduce all extirpated species at historic population levels for natural competition, and the same with native large predators. But really, to do this, we would need to remove all human changes. This is impossible, and humans continue to change things everywhere. So we must assess wildlife conflict and respond to wildlife damage. However, that being said, I want to make the point that someone can continue to be reactive and trap and remove every animal that learns to overcome its natural wariness of humans and take advantage of the resources we provide. Or we can do our best to consider long-term proactive solutions to deal with the cause of modified wildlife behavior, which in many cases is what people are doing, especially when some of those solutions may be hard to implement, but they're really simple concepts. Relevant to this and human behavior, during COVID, I worked with Cleveland Metro Park Zoo Conservation Department that does international species conservation work to identify common challenges between humans and wildlife, specifically carnivores. We looked at human behavior from a conservation psychology perspective, and briefly, this is that conservation is primarily not about biology, but about people and the choices they make. And conservation is a goal that can only be achieved by really changing behavior. So I think this is really important when we think about damage management and assessing problems and developing proactive solutions to foster wildlife conservation in a human-dominated world. If we can help the public become aware of the influence they have on wildlife, they can learn to mitigate negative behaviors on their own and consider behaviors that have a positive effect on human-wildlife coexistence. I know, probably sounds really pie in the sky, but I always say you got to believe in something. I also want to encourage everyone to remember to share the good wildlife stories. Talk about conservation successes that are the result of wildlife damage management. Talk about the value of wildlife species, highlight ecosystem function. Try to prevent the perception, especially in urban areas, that wildlife is bad or a nuisance. These 3 extirpated species are now all in Cleveland Metro Parks. In the case of the trumpeter swan, it took years of federal and state wildlife damage management in which I was involved to reduce invasive mute swan numbers to give trumpeter swans a chance in Ohio. So highlighting these species is also an opportunity to talk about conservation. This can illustrate that tremendous impact people can have on the landscape and how incredible these wildlife comebacks can be. Lastly, my final points before I turn it over to Travis, considering the importance of understanding human-wildlife relationships and preventing wildlife conflicts, it's very important to share what we learn, to share information to prevent wildlife damage. Your data and results are incredibly important. Within Cleveland Metro Parks, as I mentioned, there's always a balance between conservation and recreation. But what I also value is our education opportunities. We have nature centers, we have outdoor education programs, we have nature school programs where we can share relevant information about what we know, what we learn about wildlife conservation and the influence of humans on wildlife. So I ask you to consider opportunities where you can share relevant information to prevent wildlife conflict, to prevent damage, and share those in public programs and outreach and extension work. The results of wildlife research are very important and should be referenced and shared. This is why I think it's so incredibly valuable to have Travis share his information during the second half of this presentation, and where I'll now turn it over. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, John. While Travis is sharing his screen, wanted to refer people over to the chat. I put in 2 links there. Oh, one doesn't look like it hyperlinked, but wanted something I failed to mention is that the webinar is being recorded. And so TBS will be posting it eventually on their website. I put the link there because not only will our webinar eventually be posted, but prior webinars are also posted. And yes, it's okay. I know I got contacted by a professor who was interested in sharing this webinar with his students. We certainly encourage, that the professors in the room, please, hopefully you saw value in this webinar and you'll share it with your students. I also posted the website of our working group. All right, and with that, I want to introduce Travis. He's our final speaker, and he is a past chair of the Wildlife Damage Management Working Group. He'll be providing a case study of implementing the principles of wildlife damage management to address risks to human safety as a result of wildlife strikes to civilian aircraft. Travis is an associate director for research and senior research science, and is a senior research scientist at the University of Georgia's Savannah River Ecology Laboratory. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree in ecology and systematics from Indiana State University and a PhD in wildlife ecology from Purdue University. Travis is a wildlife ecologist and conservation biologist. His research focuses on understanding and preventing animal vehicle collisions and other human-wildlife conflicts. And I will say I got the privilege of seeing a sneak preview of John's presentation and Travis's, and both are great. And I think you all will be pretty impressed with the interesting spin that Travis will present on trying to assure human safety while also getting into renewable energy. All right, go ahead, Travis.
Thanks, Colleen. So I appreciate the great information that John gave, focusing on the principles of wildlife damage management, and especially on the management side. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what a research project might look like in wildlife damage management. And my career spanned lots of different things. Primarily, like Colleen said, I work on animal vehicle collisions. Like John, I'm an alumnus of the USDA National Wildlife Research Center, where I used to be the project leader at Sandusky. So I'm going to talk about one of the projects that my colleagues and I there in Ohio did. I'm guessing most of you on this webinar are aware that aircraft occasionally hit birds, and occasionally that can be, really bad for the people on board. You've probably all seen the pictures of SNARG and what happens when birds and aircraft collide. But I think what a lot of people don't really understand about bird strikes with aircraft is just how common it is. Now, because of the number of flights that occur every day in the United States, the likelihood of any particular flight being impacted by a bird strike is pretty low. But taken together, there are over 15,000 or so strikes to civil aircraft in the United States that are reported to the Federal Aviation Administration each year. And so this happens dozens of times every day. And as you can see, since the records were kept beginning in 1990 up till today, it's been a growing trend. There was a blip during the COVID year, but now we're back over around 16,000 strikes per year. So some really important wildlife strike statistics to know. Again, over 15,000 strikes reported per year in recent years, causing over $300 million in damages. 97% of reported strikes are to birds, although various mammals and reptiles are also struck. 7% of reported strikes causes damage to the aircraft. Usually that's minor damage, but not always. There have been 77 aircraft total losses in the past 30 years, and there have been 26 human fatalities and close to 400 injuries during that time. Other than passerines or perching birds, the groups that are most often struck are doves and pigeons, gulls, raptors, and waterfowl. And the mammal groups that are most often struck are deer and canids, especially coyotes. Those are especially concerning at airports because quite often strikes with these large mammals do cause damage to the aircraft. Now, one thing that's really important to this presentation in particular to know is that close to 3/4 of all wildlife strikes occur at the airport. So this is when during takeoff and landing, when the aircraft is still on the ground, or at these very low altitudes within the bounds of the airport. And when you think about the types of habitats that are at airports in this country, we're really talking about grassland. So other than the built up areas like the terminal and the paved areas, the runways and taxiways and so on, grassland is the dominant land cover at airports. And so my colleagues and I were wondering about 10 years ago about, just how much grassland was there at airports in the United States. And so we did a GIS study and we looked at the NIPIAS airports. Those are the larger airports that are in the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. That's what NIPIAS means. And so within that system, there's general aviation, or the smaller airports, and then the airports, the large ones that are certificated for passenger traffic by the FAA, about 521 of those. So if you take all those airports together, those 2,915 airports, and you add up all the grassland at those airports, there's over 3,300 square kilometers of grassland. So to put that into context, that's larger than the state of Rhode Island. That's just airport grasslands in the United States. And so given the predominance of grassland at airports, you can imagine that it's really important to know something about how that grassland affects bird communities, and especially the hazardous bird communities that are attracted to those sites. So there has been a lot of research done over the years, much of it done by Brian Washburn and Brad Blackwell and Tom Siemens at the National Wildlife Research Center in Sandusky, in collaboration with USDA Wildlife Services biologists around the country. And they've done studies looking at what types of grass do Canada geese like to eat, or other hazardous species that, which types of grasses are they drawn to? What height of grass is best to deter hazardous species. So that research has been done, and we know a lot about managing grass at airports. But turf grass, even though it's the dominant land cover, there has been a movement by airports over the past decade or two to try to convert some airport grasslands into other types of land covers. And so the reason why is that mowing is expensive, especially at these small airports that don't have a lot of money. It can be over $10 per hectare each time you cut the grass. Also, there is, and I'll talk about this more in a second, there's been a push by airports in recent years to become more environmentally friendly, more carbon neutral, and obviously cutting the grass is not good for that. And also, it's important to remember that turf grass is not a universal remedy for managing wildlife hazard at airports. Grassy areas can attract some of the species we're most concerned about at airports, like Canada geese and starlings and gulls. So even though it's useful, it's not a universal remedy, despite how you manage it. And so there was a push years back for additional well-researched options for land cover. So if an airport or a military airfield was going to take some turf grass areas and change it into something else, what could they do that would not increase wildlife hazards to aircraft, and potentially even better, reduce wildlife hazards over what they had with the turf grass? So we put together a paper, my colleagues at USDA and at a couple of universities and the FAA, where we speculated on the types of land covers that might be good options for airports to use. And these are the things we talked about. We talked about alternative energy production, solar arrays, biofuels. Wind energy is obviously not suitable for all areas of the airport, just a few select areas, but also agriculture, potentially oil seeds, soybeans, and forage crops. What I'm going to focus on this presentation is solar energy, because I think it really has the most potential for airports around the country. So this is something that's been happening over the past 10 to 15 years quite a bit. So this type of site where you have photovoltaic solar arrays around airports is becoming really common. One example I like to give is Fresno Yosemite Airport. So they have a 2.4 megawatt photovoltaic array they built in 2008. It only occupies 16 acres, so that's less than 1% of the total airport property, but it produces 60% of the airport's energy demand and saves them about $1 million a year. So you can imagine this is really attractive for some airports. And like I mentioned a minute ago, there's been a push by the domestic airline industry and airports around the country to become greener. And so that's another push here. And then the National Academy's Airport Cooperative Research Program put out a synthesis report. I believe that was about 6 or 7 years ago. And they looked at the different types of safety potential problems that photovoltaic arrays could cause in terms of penetration of airspace, thermal plume, turbulence, and glare. And what they found in a nutshell was that it's really not too bad. Like this is a really good option for airports. Now I want to speak just real briefly about glare, because everyone always asks me about that when I talk about this. Do the solar panels create glare for pilots? And that was addressed in that paper I just showed you. And it turns out that photovoltaic panels actually cause about as much glare as water, which is less than shingles and bare soil and vegetation and other things you could find at the airport. So, these panels are designed to absorb rather than reflect energy. So, by and large, that's not much of a concern either. Now, the FAA tried to get out in front of this because they saw these coming in at airports. And so in 2010, they put out this guidance for how an airport might go about evaluating and selecting a solar technology. But importantly, there was no information at all in this publication about wildlife hazards. So that's where we came in. We worked with the FAA to ask, do photovoltaic arrays increase wildlife hazards at airports? And there was reason to think this could be a potential issue because photovoltaic arrays provide perches, they provide shade, and those are two things that are quite often in short supply at airports. So we did this study evaluating the hazard level posed by solar arrays, and we did this in 3 states. We compared bird use of 2 land cover types with an emphasis on high-risk species. I want to explain that next. And the object here was to provide guidance to the FAA and airports. So we had 2 sites in Arizona, 2 sites in Colorado, and 1 in Ohio. And we compared bird use of paired sites at each of those locations. So there was an airfield, a regular airfield grassland, and then a nearby photovoltaic array where we looked at bird use of both of those types of habitats in each of those sites. So we did seasonal bird transects at all those sites. Now, we didn't just count the birds and compare the number of individual birds across sites because that would have missed a lot of the story. There is quite a bit of variance in hazard level across species. So in other words, if you hit a bird with an aircraft, what's the likelihood of it causing damage to that aircraft? And like I said, there's big variance. So over half of Canada goose strikes cause damage, but only 2% of barn swallow strikes cause damage, just as an example. So to account for that, we developed this bird hazard index, which is just the combined species body masses of all birds observed during these surveys. So in terms of results, we did over 1,400 surveys overall. We found 46 species of birds in the airfield compared to 37 in the photovoltaic arrays. Now, even though we found over twice the number of individual birds in the solar arrays, we found no difference in that bird hazard index across treatments. There also no effective location or any interactions, but we did see an effective season, and I'm going to show you that now. So this is that bird hazard index on the y-axis and season on the x-axis, airfield grasslands combined in the hatched bars, photovoltaic arrays in the solid bars. And again, it was about a wash. So in the fall and the spring, the bird hazard index was essentially the same in both habitat types. It was a little higher in the photovoltaic arrays in the summer. Again, that's probably the effect of providing those perches and especially shade. And in the winter, it was a little higher in the airfield grasslands, probably due to cover considerations. So I want to talk about the large birds, though, which are the most likely to cause damage to aircraft and so are the most problematic at airports. Across all treatments, 93% of the birds were the small birds under that 1.125 kilograms, which is the mean weight of birds that cause damage to aircraft. But only 9 individual birds out of all those surveys were above that weight, above that mass at photovoltaic arrays, compared to 489 at airfields. Now, that was mostly driven by common ravens at one site at an airfield in fall and winter. But even if you take out those common ravens, there were 6 times more large birds at the airfield than the photovoltaic arrays. One other thing I just want to mention briefly, most observations of birds we saw at these photovoltaic arrays were of perched birds. They were not, using it for feeding or flying over or soaring over these areas like they do on airfields. And birds don't present risk to aircraft when they're perched. So our results might actually overestimate the hazard levels of photovoltaic arrays. It might be less even than what we're reporting. So to conclude, there really aren't a whole lot of data available on the effects of solar energy development on birds. Now, there are a bunch of ongoing studies right now I know of, but it's generally assumed that when you take some type of habitat, natural habitat, and you convert it to a solar array, it's going to have a bad effect on the bird community. And our study supports the view that solar development is generally detrimental to birds at the local scale. However, that can be good for airports because you don't want birds at the airport. So low use of photovoltaic arrays by these hazardous or larger bird species could actually facilitate solar development at airports, and they could play a major role in efforts to operate greener airports and even reduce damaging bird strikes in some of these areas. Now, John mentioned the importance of getting this information out. We always try to publish our research in peer-reviewed journals, and this gives me an opportunity to shout out to my colleagues, Tom Siemens, Jason Schmidt, Jerry Blount, Brad Blackwell, Nicole Moores, Laura Tyson, and Lola Van Pelt, who helped me with this study. But in addition to the peer-reviewed study, we also consulted with the Navy, which has had several ongoing efforts to install solar panels, large arrays at some of their bases. And so we put out this white paper with the Navy to help provide guidance on how they could go about doing that. So that's my example of a research study in wildlife damage management and what that can look like. I'd like to thank the FAA and the other folks that helped us get this done.
All right, thanks, Travis. Thank you so much. So now we're entering, we have some time for Q&A. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A. We already have one question, and this is for Travis. Travis, what about the theorized lake effect that could potentially attract waterfowl species to solar arrays?
Yeah, so the idea there is that the solar arrays might mimic the look of a large body of water to some birds, and they land and they're attracted and land in those areas, and they can't get back off the ground or they're hurt. That has been looked at, and I can tell you that there is an ongoing, very large study on that exact topic right now by some colleagues at Purdue University. So we hope to have some more information on that pretty soon. I can tell you that from my point of view, this is just me talking, although that can happen sometimes, it's not nearly, in my view, frequent enough to be a big detriment to the installation at airports. It is a potential problem in some circumstances, but I think it's greatly outweighed by the benefits.
Hi, there we go. Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute. All right, thanks, Travis. Got a question for John. John, have the wildlife damage management challenges in general changed during the last 15 to 20 years? And if yes, then how or in which direction?
maybe I was naive early in my career and thought I was just going to study wildlife in natural settings, but I think it has changed. I think when I consider my 25-year career, I remember talking about seeing turkeys, actually, where Travis and I both worked at Plumbrook, and people like, oh, we don't have turkey populations, but they're expanding. But we went from expanding turkey populations to seeing generations that are born comfortable in backyards and seeing a distinct change as more and more species take advantage of urban resources, lose their natural wariness. And then some people think it's great and want to lure them in and get pictures, and others are like, we hate them. So it seems like more and more species I'm hearing about that have, who would have thought a bobcat, would become, Julie Young's work documenting what's going on with bobcats in some areas, or gray fox when we're thinking about them as a remote species. So I think it's become more challenging as wildlife generations or individuals learn to overcome their wariness and survive in a backyard. And those generations are born into a different environment, which is the urban environment.
Yeah, and I would say the change I've also seen is just what John mentioned, some wildlife species adapting to human disturbance, adapting to living near people, partly because they have to. Humans are living closer to them. But concurrently, are people really adapting to then living with the wildlife? And that's the problem. As John said, usually the reaction from the public is two extremes. Either they're not only excited, but a bit too passionate about that wildlife, which results in bad human behavior, such as direct feeding and other things, trying to get close to get that selfie, maybe do other things to help. But then you've got that other extreme that's starting to grow of they're seeing this wildlife. They don't know how to live with the wildlife. They don't know why the wildlife is there. And they're viewing it as a pest and treating it as such. And that's the concern I have, is that certain species that agencies, in particular state wildlife agencies, had worked hard to restore, such as beavers, such as raccoons, are suddenly going from a valued wildlife species to being viewed as a pest. We're back in that, we're in a cycle. So I know that's a growing concern. And of course, wildlife damage management, we're trying to do that balance, integrative approach using lethal, non-lethal means. Let's see, I have another question. John, question is, have monitoring coyotes with your reporting system allowed you to prevent wildlife conflicts?
Yeah, I think it has. It's been interesting when we start to see, sometimes I think, well, okay, is it worth all the time and effort? But when I think about the rabbit coyote, right, and the monitoring and the reporting system, but we also been able to get ahead of behavior when all of a sudden we see, I call it shadowing, right, barking and following by coyotes. It's not directly aggressive, but it's interesting. Do we need to get involved? And the reporting system has not only allowed me to filter some of that out, but then also to talk to park staff and park users that go, oh yeah, that's somebody who loves to let their Doberman and Rottweiler chase coyotes in this area. And our GPS collared coyote, shows there's a den there. So I think that monitoring allows us to really put additional efforts through police enforcement of our laws, through education and cards and signage, to really get ahead of issues before someone gets bit and we got to remove a coyote. And it's really because, somebody induced that behavior. So I could give a bunch of but for time's sake, yes.
Yeah, we are approaching the end, but I think I want to get this last question in that we got for Travis. So this will be the last question of the webinar. And the question is, what other research has been done on alternatives to turf grass at airports?
Yeah, so most of that research has been done out of the National Wildlife Research Center's Ohio Field Station while I was there as project leader, and some of it's ongoing. So we did quite a bit of work looking at cellulosic biofuel crops, so switchgrass and native warm season grasses, and some of that's been published and some of it's still being worked on. But it looks like some of these feedstocks, cellulosic feedstocks for biofuels, might be a pretty good option for some areas. Now, again, I don't mean to suggest that you can take out all the turf grass and carpet the entire airport with these alternative land covers. Near the air operations area, especially in runways and taxiways, you have to have shorter vegetation like turf grass. But some of these giant airports like Denver, for example, there is quite a bit of land available for other types of land cover. And so those feedstocks, and we've also looked at certain types of agriculture that might be useful. Agriculture is surprisingly common at airports around the country. And what we've seen is that quite often the wrong types of things are planted, like corn and other types of crops that are really attractive to wildlife. And so we've been trying to provide some options that are better from a wildlife hazard perspective. Certain types of hay crops, for example, not all, but certain types might be a good option for some airports.
All right, thanks, Travis. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all the questions. It was great to see that we got a lot of questions, so thank you for your interest. Thank you for attending this webinar. If you missed part of it or you want to relive the highlights, again, TWS will be posting this webinar on their website. Again, the link is in the chat. You can also just go to wildlife.org and navigate to the webinar page from that website. But yeah, at that, I'd like to conclude this webinar. I want to thank our speakers, Travis and John, for helping to put this together. Again, this was our working group's first webinar, so it's pretty exciting. And we look forward to providing more webinars to TWS. And so with that, I guess I just want to let everybody have a good rest of their day, and hopefully you all have a good weekend and stay safe out there. All right, thanks everybody.